In 1993, Halloween lovers were graced with Hocus Pocus, one of the best Halloween movies to this day. Hocus Pocus combined the genres of horror and comedy, and everyone who watched it fell in love. The film was based on Roald Dahl's The Witches, and it follows Max Dennison and his little sister Dani as they try to adapt to their new lives in Salem, Massachusetts. It's Halloween, a holiday that Max appears to hate, but after being forced to take Dani trick-or-treating, he ends up getting to spend the night with his crush, Allison. The night wasn't all fun and games though, because it wasn't long before the group accidentally managed to resurrect a wicked trio of witches that would spend the rest of the night attempting to capture young Dani and regain eternal life. Allison, though having a kind heart as Max did, is the opposite of him in the way that she loves Halloween and everything supernatural, while Max couldn't hate it more. Throughout the film, we learned that her family not only owned the Sandersons' home after the witches had been killed, but we also find out that her family has quite the influence around the town of Salem as well. Could there be more connecting Allison's family to the Sanderson house, other than just ownership though? Well, as a matter of fact, yes, there could be. If you look at the very subtle details in the film, they actually all point directly to Allison being the fourth Sanderson sister, who was, throughout the movie, pulling the strings in the background the entire time. And with this theory, the deeper you go, the more convincing it seems to get. So hold on, because it's about to get crazy. Starting with the most obvious clue to Allison being a witch has us looking at Allison's love for everything Halloween. Growing up in Salem, Massachusetts, this would make a ton of sense, given that it's the same location that the Salem witch trials were held, where multiple hearings took place to determine whether or not people accused of witchcraft were actually witches. The trials were conducted between February of 1692 to May of 1693, during which, no pun intended, 13 people were found guilty of being witches. All were sentenced to death. This has turned the town of Salem into a gateway for all things spooky, and has led most people who live there to indulge heavily in the festivities of Halloween and holidays like it. So it makes perfect sense for Allison to be obsessed with Halloween, and as she said, really into witches. However, many speculate that there is more to Allison's obsession than just living in Salem. Now, it definitely takes more than a fascination with the subject to make someone a witch, but taking a look at the entire reason that Allison offered to take Max and Dani to the Sanderson house in the first place has us speculating otherwise. If you remember, it's her parents who own the property, which has since been renamed the Sanderson Museum, and has become a small attraction for the town. And with Allison's parents as the owner, Max and Dani ended up having an easier time sneaking onto the premises and into the house itself. What's really curious though, is when you look at how accurate and well preserved all of the items in the home were kept. I mean, the inside of the house looked exactly the same as it did when it was home to the Twisted Sanderson sisters, except with a few more cobwebs and such. They even kept Sarah's lucky rat tail exactly where it was when she left it. I mean, sure, most museums put a lot of effort into keeping things preserved and historically accurate, but weren't things in the Sanderson home just a little too perfect? Well, this theory suggests that the reason for it remaining in such a preserved state is that the property was actually being taken care of and maintained by other witches. In this case, those other witches would have been Allison and her family. Now, an argument against this fact states that the reason that Allison's family owns the museum is due to the fact that it may have been her ancestors who actually persecuted the Sanderson sisters way back when. Though this isn't directly mentioned in the movie, if you take a look at some of the clues about her family, you'll see that it is definitely a possibility worth noting. Obviously, Allison's family is fairly wealthy considering the size of their home. The family was also known to host a historic-themed party for Halloween every year. This led a lot of people to speculate that her family has been established in the town of Salem for generations, with some even thinking that this proves that they were directly involved in the trial. But even so, even if they had been involved in the Salem witch trials or the trial of the Sanderson sisters, that doesn't necessarily mean they weren't witches themselves. Back in those days, it was rumored that witches often hid in plain sight. What better cover for a witch than being one of the people hunting and hanging witches? It would be a great way for them to keep attention away from themselves and off of their family. And out of respect for the witches that they had to sacrifice, they decided to preserve their home for generations to come, using the concept of a museum as a good cover for it. The next big thing that is definitely worth talking about is Allison's keen senses. It seems like throughout the entire movie, Allison more so than anyone else has a connection to the Sanderson sisters. She was always the first one to notice when something was about to go wrong, whether there were actual signs of it or not. She would somehow know that things were about to go awry. For instance, surely you remember when our heroes of the movie believed that they had put an end to the Sinister Sisters once and for all. Well, obviously that wasn't the case. And who was the first person to bring up that something was wrong? That's right, Allison. She says, word for word, something isn't right. And then, to further egg on that she could sense the sisters somehow, as she was getting ready to leave Max and Danny's house, she stopped dead in her tracks as if she was able to tell that the Sandersons were nearby. Meanwhile, Max, the owner of the house, hadn't the slightest idea that his little sister was in the process of being taken by the sisters. Allison's intuition about the witches was always way stronger than the Dennison siblings, and a lot of people believe that it's because she herself was a witch. Alright, so if Allison is in fact a witch, why wasn't she trying to capture Danny or the other children like the Sanderson sisters did? The answer to that is as simple as Allison just being a good witch. Now, I know that might seem like an easy answer, but there is a lot of evidence that supports this idea. Like, let's take a look at the two outfits that we see her wearing throughout the majority of the movie. At first, Allison can be seen wearing red, but if you pay attention to one of her first interactions with Max as she's leaving the school, she pulls her hood up over her head. This normally wouldn't have been anything odd or anything to think about, but when you notice the same exact look mimicked later in the film by Mary Sanderson, it kind of makes you question whether there was something more to it, like a nod that Allison shares the same witchly ties as the Sanderson sisters. But forget the red that she was wearing. When we saw her later in the movie at the Halloween party when she teams up with Max and Danny, she is donning almost white. The dress she was wearing and the sweater that she wears are both mostly white, which is often the color worn by morally good witches and sorcerers in other lore and fiction. And the icing on the cake to all of it is the fact that Winifred Sanderson literally called Allison a good witch in the movie when she looked at her glaringly and said, "Clever little white witch." A common question when this theory is being discussed is, what about the graveyard? Binks pointed out in the film that witches are not allowed to walk on hallowed ground, which is what a graveyard is considered. And it's the same reason why in most lore, vampires are unable to enter churches. This is shown to be true when Winifred steps onto the graveyard, even though she had only stepped on the ground for a few seconds, she'd begun to turn to stone. Well, if Allison was a witch, why was she able to walk in the graveyard just fine? Well, the answer could be as simple as a small loophole in the rule. Much like a vampire would be allowed inside your home after being invited in, maybe a witch that was not considered to be evil was permitted to step on hallowed ground without being forced to face the consequences. Another thing to think about is the scene when Allison figured out that she could use salt to deter the Sandersons. After taking a look at Winifred's spellbook, she saw that in it, Winifred had noted that salt could be used in a way to form a barrier around a potential victim of witch attacks. When she read this, she immediately put that knowledge to use and began to make barriers all around the Dennisons' home. But she didn't just stop there. She also managed to throw some salt at the witches to keep them away. At first, it seems like it's just because it was salt. But what if there was more to it than that? What if, without knowing it, Allison actually stumbled on a spell to use salt against the witches, and with her being a witch, she was able to imbue it with her powers and cast it towards the Sandersons? It is possible, and definitely explains why the salt was that powerful against the Sanderson sisters in the first place. Now, with all of this being said, it's still pretty clear that if Allison was a witch, she wasn't a very powerful one, or at least hadn't fully developed her abilities yet, especially without the proper training. I mean, when you think about it, though she had some sound ideas, at the end of the day, her plans never really worked out the way that she intended. For instance, every time that she came up with a way to put an end to the Sanderson sisters, she only ever ended up keeping them at bay for a little bit. She was great at thinking of ways to stall the sisters, but couldn't quite figure out how to get rid of them for good. This is likely because she is a novice witch at best and has yet to reach her full potential. That's also most likely why she wasn't able to use any of the many brooms that she handled throughout the movies to fly. Instead, she just used them as weapons to bat the flying Sandersons out of the sky, or why she didn't know how to help Binks. She knew his story by heart and even managed to get a glimpse at the spell that was used to change him into a cat, but couldn't figure out how it worked or how to reverse it. Had she been a more knowledgeable witch, that would not have been an issue for her. Speaking of the book, it also kind of seemed like Allison was drawn to it, didn't it? I mean, Binks warned her and Max not to go near it over and over again. But as soon as they had thought they won and Binks was asleep and unable to interfere, Allison defied him. She convinced Max to open the book. Could that have been because she could feel the book wanting to awaken the witch inside of her? No matter how you look at it, it seems like Allison was somehow connected to the Sanderson sisters, whether she realized it or not. And if that's the case, then it is highly likely that she also, to some extent, had powers. There was even a point where one of the Sandersons mentions that Allison might be one of them, which may have been the movie's way of telling us that she was a Sanderson this whole time. She could have even been a direct descendant of one of the sisters after being reincarnated over several generations. That would mean she most likely would still have a bit of power, even if it wasn't as much as the full-fledged witches. Regardless of what side you take on if Allison was a witch or not, you can't deny that Allison has at least some deeper connection to the witches than any other character in the film. Hocus Pocus was an instant classic and is always a fun one to rewatch, especially after hearing a new theory like this one. And with more and more news coming out about the upcoming sequel, it seems like fans couldn't be more excited. Maybe we will even get to see Allison after reaching her full potential. Who knows? What do you think is going to happen in this sequel that's being made almost 30 years after the original? Are you hoping to see any familiar faces? Be sure to let us know. For now, that's all, Disney fans. Let us know what video you'd like to see next in the comments, and like and subscribe for more magically packed videos.